Do you know what the most popular beverage is in the United States? Anybody have a guess? You're close. What'd you say? That's an under Coke. Surprisingly, it's actually water. You wouldn't expect that. Number 2 is coffee, and then Coca-Cola. Now, obviously, water is good for you. Coffee is good in moderation. But I don't think anyone considers Coke or any soft drink to be healthy, really. I ran across an interesting art project this past week, that kind of aims to be somewhat of a satire, but it's also a way to inform people of how unhealthy Coke really can be. It's called ? Or the undrinkable can. It is a can filled with Coke that is custom made to be impossible to open. It sits in an individually numbered display case with 39 grams of sugar. You can see it at the bottom there if you squint. Each one is sequentially numbered and sequentially priced. So you can still go and buy one of these, but the more they sell, the pricier it gets. So number 1 was $1. Number 2 was $2, etc. As of the time I was writing this, you can get number 265 for $265. And it's there to promote this idea that we really don't know what we're putting inside our bodies usually. Now, Coke is bad for you. There's no argument about that. But we don't really like to think too hard about what we can eat and drink, do we? I know, though, that most of us need to. I bet most people in this room today have some kind of dietary restriction. There's something that either your doctor or your body told you you shouldn't have anymore. In my case, one of mine is caffeine. I used to drink caffeine like it was nothing. But now too much makes me sick. So in the morning, I'll have my half-calf coffee and maybe a tea later on. And why is it always the good-tasting, enjoyable stuff that we have to avoid? Why can't the doctor say lima beans are bad for you? Maybe it's dairy and ice cream doesn't like you anymore. Maybe it's spicy foods, sugar, or salt. Sometimes it's a good idea to avoid them. Sometimes it's life-threatening. But in just about every case, I bet all of us had that inner denial argument. My doctor says I shouldn't have this, but I really want it. I've had it all my life. Why can't I keep on doing what I want? Maybe just a little won't hurt me. I notice nobody's saying anything because I know you've all had this conversation. It's too hard to avoid. I'm not even going to try. Temptations abound when we go to the grocery store. And not just there. Do you know how many restaurants I see when driving around all of north central Ohio? There are temptations everywhere. And normally what I'd be doing is showing you a video here, but it's not going to have any sound. Sometimes temptations can drive you a little crazy. I'm glad it works, so we're going to laugh. You drive around and you see things you really shouldn't have, and you make a decision. You go to the store and you see that item that you really miss having. You talk to your doctor or your spouse, and suddenly there's a restriction, and you know what you have to do. You have to decide. Will I give in to the temptation, or will I stay strong? Will I act like an adult and see the wisdom in refraining, or will I act like a child and get what I want no matter the consequences? In modern vernacular, am I going to put my big boy pants on or not? In fact, it's not a surprise that life is chock full of those questions and decisions. The longer you live, the more you face things that you would have much rather left a mystery. But when we mature, as we grow up, we have to put on our big boy pants and our big girl pants and face life head on, even though it goes against our first instincts. And that's kind of where we're headed in Ecclesiastes. We'll be in the first part of chapter 7 today. So go ahead and turn there, and we'll meet there in a minute. And while you get there, let me remind you of what's led up to this. In the first 6 chapters, we saw this grand experiment that Solomon enacted and the conclusions that he reached. Does life have meaning? And is there a way that we can achieve that meaning in this life? How do we find satisfaction? And Solomon tried several different avenues that he thought would provide that meaning, that fulfillment for him. But ultimately he decided that whatever we do, as long as it's contained on this earth, in this life, in the end, it winds up as meaningless, fleeting. It never lasts. Everything from the greatest works of engineering to the greatest pleasures of life, it someday comes to an end. And if that's so, the question he asks is, then what's it worth? On the other hand, if we add into the things of this life the idea of divine purpose, if we put God in the picture and realize he put us here for a reason, then we have influence that lasts. We can do good and we can see good in the things that we do, both religious and secular. And when we see it, it is blessed by God. So he gave us 3 chapters of practical thoughts and examples of how we should seek to live under the sun. That was last week. That leads us to the second half of the book. So now that we've seen the conclusions he came to, now that he can say for certain his experiment was a success, he found a solution, as long as you have God in the picture, you can find that fulfillment, we can move on to the application. So from this point on, Solomon goes into what we might call counselor mode. He's giving us proverbs and stories that are designed to make us think based on the conclusions of the first 6 chapters. And here's where we have to put on those big boy and big girl pants. Because as I've said before, Solomon doesn't hold back on uncomfortable topics. Here in chapter 7, we're going to look at a list of proverbs that all go together, and we're going to get several comparisons between concepts. And for the most part, the choice that Solomon says is better is also the one that you kind of have to be a mature of mind and mature as a follower of God to really understand. They go against the grain of what we've been taught. They go against what culture says is important. There are 8 contrasts that Solomon makes in the first 14 verses. So we're going to read all 14 together, and then we're going to take a quick look into each one. And we can't really exhaust each one, but we're going to look into each one and just see what we can learn from that. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, we're going to start in verse 1. A good name is better than precious ointment, the day of death than the day of birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. This also is vanity. Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money. The advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful. In the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. Like I said, what we've got here are 8 different contrasts that Solomon points out and then tells us which one is better. And the idea is we're supposed to look at this and then take a moment and contemplate. Why is this better than the other? So we'll start with an easy one. Number one, reputation versus riches. Verse 1, a good name is better than precious ointment. Solomon starts off with something that this world really tries to convince us is not true. Wealth is not, in fact, the end-all, be-all of life. In actuality, if you have to choose between the two of them, it is far better to cultivate your reputation, cultivate your honor, than it is to accumulate wealth. Or maybe we could say it this way. It's better to raise your reputation, even if it costs you monetary opportunities, and it's no good to reverse it and get money by losing your reputation. Solomon said this several times. One example is Proverbs 22. A good name is more desirable than great riches. To be esteemed is better than silver or gold. Now that's easy for Solomon to say. He's already got all the wealth. And in fact, he really did give up a lot of his honor to gain all that wealth. When we talk about Solomon, it's hard to talk about Solomon's life without bringing up the fact that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now, why did he marry all those women? Most of them were for political alliances. And that very much ended up filling the nation's treasury. But not only was this against God's plan at all, these women came from other pagan nations that followed these other pagan gods, and Solomon participated in some very truly evil practices to worship those gods with his wives. You know, when we think of Solomon's life as a whole, he doesn't have that great of a reputation. Now, if we're right, and this is being written at the very end of his life, that's a good thing because we see a bit of repentance in his life. But if you just read through the books of Samuel and the Kings and the Chronicles, when you get to the end of Solomon's life, he's not in a good place. Maybe that's part of what inspired him to write about wealth in this book so much. We've already seen that wealth eventually just ends up in someone else's hands, and they might just waste it. And if the enjoyment of money doesn't come from God, it's just vanity. But a good reputation, that follows us even after death. Hebrews chapter 11 is what we normally call the faith chapter. It lists the deeds of hero after hero of the Old Testament and what they did out of faith. And the chapter starts and ends with the phrase, they were commended for their faith. People look back to them and say, this is why I follow this person. This is why this is a hero. Were these people perfect? By no means. But their mistakes are not mentioned in Hebrews 11. Just their victories. You know, we have that to look forward to as well. You know, the pictures of heaven don't mention how much we accumulated here on this earth, but they do mention our names living on forever, written in the Lamb's Book of Life, written on the walls of the temple. Your reputation precedes you into eternity. So your reputation is better than your wealth. Okay, that one wasn't too bad, was it? Number 2, your birthday versus your death day. Which is better? Well, according to Solomon, again in verse 1, the day of your death is better than the day of your birth. Now, the day you die will be better than the day you were born. That's a bit harder to think about, isn't it? We celebrate birthdays. We don't quite celebrate death days quite the same. Well, why is this? Well, let's compare the two. According to Solomon, in this book, so far, the day of birth is just the beginning of a whole life of problems. A life full of questions and hardships. Now, of course, there's good stuff too, but even those pleasures are just vanity under the sun. You read the writings of guys like Jeremiah and Job, and they'll tell you in detail how they feel about their birthdays. Job cursed the day he was born. On the other hand, after death, that's when all the pain stops. There's no more hard decisions to make. There's no more worry about the future. There's no more need to think about the philosophies of life. Of course, this is all assuming you have that good reputation we talked about, that you're in favor of God. But that day will be far better than the day of birth. Paul dealt with this in Philippians. Paul says, "For me to live is Christ, to die is gain. If I go on living in the body, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far, but it's more necessary for you that I remain in the body." And if we really think about that, then we can say, along with Solomon, my death day will be better than my birthday. And if that one is true, then the next logical question is it better to go to a party or is it better to go to a funeral? Verses 2 through 6. Everybody loves a good party, right? We all hate going to funerals. So which is better? According to Solomon, it's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting. Now, why in the world would that be true? You've all been to a funeral. You know it's not a great place to be. Well, he tells us. Basically says it's the end that we all face. And when we go to a funeral, we are faced with that fact. And we're reminded of the fact that we're standing face to face with mortality. We're reminded about how short life is. And it makes us, if we're mature, it makes us, if we have our big boy pants on, it makes us prepare for that eventuality. Sorrow causes change in us. It makes us see the need for change, and it inspires us to move on those changes. Someone very wise once said, "Change never happens until the pain of changing is less than the pain of staying the same." That's the meaning behind that phrase. He says, the sad face is good for the heart. On the other hand, most of the time, a party is not the place you go to improve yourself. It's where you go to get away from the big questions. At a party, you are much more likely to ignore the things in life that would improve it in favor of what Solomon says is the song of fools. We're there to feel good, not to make ourselves better. He says, it's like the crackling of thorns under a pot. If you've ever built a campfire and put something with thorns in it, you know thorns make a lot of noise. And they burn real quick. But they don't supply what you've really intended for them. They burn too quickly and too low to actually be useful. Number 4. The end versus the beginning. Verse 8. Again, Solomon points to the end of a thing being superior to the beginning. Think of a project, something you want to complete. Which is better? To start on that project, not knowing if you'll actually finish it, or to have it done and complete? You know, it's only when our intentions are complete that we can look at them and really be satisfied. Listen to David, Psalm 126. Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. Those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves with them. Now, there's a lot in those two verses that we could go into, but the simple fact is, while a thing is going on, you don't know if you'll ever complete it. But when it's done, you can find satisfaction. And to keep us focused on that truth, Solomon goes to the next one, which is pride versus patience. Verses 8 and 9. Now, this one's an easy one to say. Not quite as easy to practice. Of course, patience is better than pride. We know that. The Bible's clear. Worldly pride is evil. It's to be controlled at all costs. Pride is the root of every sin that exists. Pride puffs us up and keeps us from acknowledging who is truly in charge of our lives. On the other hand, patience is always shown biblically as a great virtue. It's part of the fruit of the Spirit. We're told to pursue patience. We're told to cultivate it, make it grow. Patience is a major component of not giving up in this life. But the reasoning that Solomon gives here is just a little more particular. Because as long as we can keep things vague, we can really agree with things. But here, he specifically points to the fact that pride always leads to something else. Pride and anger, pride and conflict go hand in hand because the proud spirit can't allow for any disagreement or dissent. And that, Solomon says, is the attitude of a fool. In Proverbs, he writes that very famous wisdom, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And whoever is patient has great understanding, but one who is quick-tempered displays folly. See, patience leads to understanding and peace, and pride leads to destruction and contention. And we can say that and make it sound really good, but do we actually live like that's true? Quickly now, we'll go to number 6. Past versus the present, verse 10. Solomon says it's not wise to spend a lot of time contemplating the good old days. You know people like this. Surely none of you are people like this. The old days were a lot better than today. We can think of 100 different reasons for that. But we can also, if we're honest with ourselves, think of 1,000 why they weren't that good. Let me give you one I hear on a weekly basis. I go fix a refrigerator. Inevitably, I'm going to hear, I had a fridge that lasted me 30 years, and it's still going. These new ones break after just a few. The old days were better, right? But we conveniently forget those old fridges also shot your electric bills through the roof. That's not really the point that Solomon's making. The thing he's trying to get across is the attitude that we have should never be live in the past. The past can't be changed. You can only live in the present. And if we spend our time longing for the past, then we'll never make an impact on the here and now. It's as simple as that. I'll tell you one that I hear all the time, and it tickles me in some points. I have heard probably more than 100 times, people complain, say, you know, they don't teach kids cursive anymore. And then you ask them, so what? I've never gotten a good answer for that. What does it harm that we don't teach cursive anymore? I've never gotten a good answer. But it's something that we hold on to that's in the past, that we can say, I want to live there, instead of turning to the future. Now, again, those are kind of silly examples, but they point out a bigger problem. We cannot just spend our time living as if the past was all there is, when really we have the present to look forward to. No, future look forward to. Present we live now. Number 7, wisdom versus wealth, verses 11 and 12. Nobody argues that wealth has its advantages. You can't really live without money. Money turns into the food we eat, the homes we live in. It provides not only the essentials, but some of the luxuries we enjoy. Money can make life a lot easier. But of course, Solomon points us to the superior of the two, wisdom. And we've already touched on this, so we're not going to exhaust it. But at the end of the day, or rather at the end of your life, your wealth isn't going with you, and your wise decisions will follow you. Solomon tells us that wisdom is a source of life, and the wise person will know what to do to preserve that life. We know the old adage of what happens with a fool and his money. So number 8, last one. Annoyance versus acceptance. One of the famous things involved in Alcoholics Anonymous is the serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's this argument in a nutshell. There are things in this life that we cannot change. No matter how hard we try, no matter how much we rail against it, we cannot make certain things happen. For example, no matter how much you want to, you cannot make the snow go away. On a bigger scale, we've talked about God having a purpose, and we can't change his purpose. That purpose of his makes us have good days and bad days. And nothing we do can make the hard times go away faster. And nothing we do will make the good days stay longer. So how do you deal with that? Well, Solomon says acceptance. When the times are good, hold on to them. Enjoy the peace while it's there. When times get rough, understand they're not going to stay that way. God is still in charge. This life comes at us full sprint, and something new is always on the horizon. And it does no good to shake our fists at what we can't change. Back in chapter 3, he said, there is a time for laughing. There's a time for weeping. Now let's be very clear. These comparisons are not about good versus evil. They're about good versus better. Solomon lived a life that was full of everything any of us could ever want. He experienced whatever in life he desired. He came out of it on the other end saying, it's not worth it to live this life under the sun. So when we see these contrasts and they seem like foreign concepts, we have to keep in mind Solomon is trying to keep us from going down the same path that he did and finding it all vanity. You and I, we have an advantage that Solomon did not. See, he was still working on seeing truth with only half the information. We know the full story. We know where true satisfaction comes from and how much it actually cost. Every time we look at a cross, it should remind us of the price that was paid for us. Every time we remember the sacrifice that Jesus made, it should motivate us to make better choices. We know God so loved this world that he gave his son. And that means I can face a life of hard choices, knowing I've already made the one choice that means I win in the end. I can live with acceptance of this life because this life isn't all there is. I can choose wisdom and honor over the wealth of this world. I can face the present and learn from the past. I can rejoice at a funeral and say with Paul, it's better to be with him. And all because he went to the cross for me. Now, if you've made that decision, you can say that same thing with me. I know what my future holds. If not, this is the chance. We end each sermon, each service with an invitation hymn. And it's an invitation to come to him for the first time. It's an invitation to take a moment and think about what the sermon talked about and see if there's any changes that need to be made. But if you want to know the best place to have a good reputation, it's to have your name written in the Lamb's Book of Life. And that can happen for you. It doesn't take much. It just takes everything. You surrender everything to him because he's the one in charge anyway. So with our belief, we look at our life of sin and say, I don't want to live that way anymore. It's called repentance. We take what God has done for us, and we show the world with our words and with our deeds. That's called confession. We obey him in the waters of baptism. And then from that point on, we make those decisions that say, I want to live life like this life is not all there is. Because it's not. And so we go forward. So the invitation hymn that was picked out for today is called, Is My Name Written There? That's the question that Solomon started with. Is it better to have the riches of this world or the reputation that lasts forever? Is my name written in his book of life? Is yours? Let's stand and sing.